friends, I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and we are talking all things Battletech once again. I have one that might take a bit, so bear with me, and I hope you enjoy it. It's called "Why So Many Mediocre Mech Designs?" You know, why? One person's subpar mech is another person's wonder mech. One of the things that I hear a lot of is a lot of people go, "I don't like that design." That design is undergunned. It's under armored. It's too slow for its weight class. It lacks this. It lacks that. It has a combination of all of those, making it even less than less. Its survivability is poor. Its functionability is poor. Its integration capabilities with other units or other machines is poor. Why do we have so many of those? Why are they so bad? The list just goes on and on. And why is that? What are we missing here? Well, let's take into a consideration the modern age. If you look at the modern military organizations of most major countries today, they're pretty uniform. We use X amount of tank styles. We do not have 10 different tanks from 50 years worth of generations. Our Air Force, on the other hand, has multiple types of aircraft. Some are very cutting edge and fifth generation or whatever, and some are still second generation or third generation. If you look at the venerable B-52 as an example, it is a behemoth, and it has survived many decades beyond its original designer's conception, in part because of economics, in part because of functionality. If we look at weapon systems, one of the most classic weapon systems in the U.S. military for the Army is the 50 caliber machine gun, the Maw Deuce. The Maw Deuce as a design has not changed all that much since its initial conception in the early 40s or late 30s or whenever it came out. And it's still a beast of a machine that can put out some heavy duty firepower, and more importantly, it's quite reliable. The AK-47, for example, you will see these Kalashnikovs still in function, still in service, some of them dating back to World War II, all over the world in the hands of anybody and everybody that can get their hands on them. And they were still manufacturing up until recent years, and still are in some corners of the world, to my understanding. And the reason for that is it's the simplicity of the design, the rugged equipment that machinery holds up. The weapons are something that can be abused and misused and still continue to function, and can be easily repaired by a whole lot of people who do not have a lot of complicated infrastructure to support them. So some of our Western weapon systems, for example, are quite finicky or fragile. Oh, they're quite effective and they're devastating, but in reality, over a lot of heavy use and less than ideal conditions, they're going to fail, and or their ammunition requirements are going to cause problems. So this goes on the same thing. So as of 3025, with heavy losses in industrial capacity, creating an ongoing, a growing number of issues. Starlink era weapon systems and tech become impossible to replace. In some cases, entire mech designs become rare or cease to exist altogether. A near constant state of war creates often unsuitable or unstable or unsustainable demands for replacement mechs, vehicles, etc. The usual decades or longer stretches of relative peace don't exist. I mean, even in the eras of quote peace between the great houses during the various succession wars, it's reduced to a lot of low-level raiding and border skirmishing. So the actual conflict doesn't really wrap down, and it does wrap. And then when you add that with the sheer destructive power that was unleashed during the first and second succession wars, to build a factory complex can take a couple of years. To build a very sophisticated, complex set of factory complexes can take much longer, and may be impossible if you're continually being disrupted for one reason or another, where you can't get the resources because they're vitally needed somewhere else. You can't get the transportation you need the material to get these materials around. Once again, remember, this first and second succession war devastates the inner sphere's transport capacity. The jump ship fleets are just ream something fierce. during those two conflicts, and they never recover. Even into the modern era, the 3150 era, or whatever we are at the current stage of Battletech, the sheer jump ships are not quite as fragile and as thankless as they once were. So they're obviously getting much more production put out, but they still are nowhere near pre First Succession War levels, let alone the golden era of Starlink. So there's just myriad reasons why there's the problems with this. And so when we look at designs that underperform are rarely discarded or replaced entirely. So when you have entire infrastructures and ecospheres, entire house factions that need copious amounts of war material, nothing is going to be discarded, even if it's barely functionable or being held together by duct tape and wire. It's still going to see some use somewhere. Where we see mechs that are generations old, hundreds of years old in some cases, jump ships that are hundreds of years old. We see drop ships that are hundreds of years old. And the older, the harder they are to maintain them. They just get passed down the pike. We become more and more. We see more and more of these designs cropping up, where if we don't want to use it, somebody else will use it. And if our frontline units don't want to use it or can't use it, then our second line units will end up with them and be grateful they got them. And our third line units will be grateful they got them. And if they don't end up with them, then the private armies of the minor nobility and the corporations and third-party factions, bandits, that just Uncle Joe, the crazy farmer with an urban mech in his barn, this is how they get them. All right, it's the same with all weapon systems. Why is the crappiest mech grade, vehicle grade weapon system in manufacture the autocannon 2? It's heavy. It has some great range, but it has almost no impact damage wise. It's really meant for hunting much smaller, lighter, and lightly armored things, preferably I don't know, ammo carriers and crap like that. That's that you need that one lucky crit shot before you're just not going to put enough ammo down range to affect most machines with it. And everybody complains about it for the most part. Most people, there's always a few champions of it that they just, by the sheer love about, because it's different, or because they have some knack for using it in creative ways, or because it is. But why, from a perspective of in-game world, is it still around and still significant in numbers and still being manufactured? This was the earliest adaptations of the autocannon system. Well, it should have been retired and benched a long time ago. Well, because there just isn't enough shit to go around, and everybody needs every little thing we can get. And that's why we still see them in the field, and we still tap them and still make use of them, right? Just saying. So we never get rid of anything. And then stuff that gets badly damaged. Once again, consider the average mech. How many various components are there in that mech? And we talk about that autocannon. Well, that autocannon is made up of what, 20, 30 different parts? And some of those parts and components can be adapted to or plugged into another system. So some of those autocannon 2 mechanical parts potentially could be utilized in AC-10s and AC-20s. So keeping a stockpile of those AC-2s around, if nothing else, gives you a stockpile of parts to cannibalize from. It's the same thing with mechs, right? Just pointing that out. So as of the Starlink era technology capacity diminishes, so did the knowledge and skills required to retool these things, mostly the automated Starlink era factories. That's something that they touch upon every now and then in the lore, but it gets played down or it gets ignored by a lot of people that don't get that at the height of the Starlink, at the golden age of interstellar commerce. And remember, I did a video on the Periphery book, the Periphery source book here. Just whether I posted it yet or not, it's there. It's this world called Comstock, and it's out in the Periphery. Eventually, it becomes under the aegis of the Marian hegemony. But after the reunification war, and there's a number of decades and years there that's relatively peaceful, and before the before the Amherst crisis cranks up, This world, the Starlink and its administration decides this world should be solely devoted to the manufacture of shoes, right? Shoes. And so that's all it does. It has some arable land, but they're discouraged from farming it. So they bring in the food from neighboring planets and other systems nearby that can produce them in large numbers. They bring in the raw materials, so leather and other materials needed to make the shoes from yet another planet and system. And they bring in the parts and equipment they need to manufacture and maintain the factories, etc. So all this is a truly interlinked interstellar economy. And then shit hits the fan. The shit hits the fan. The world's cut off. There's food support. The food source dries up. The transport fleets are decimated, so they're just not getting the shipments in. The only thing they're getting on a regular basis is ships of leather and meat from the one world that's providing them with leather. But for the most part, the lion's share of the population is being decimated by famine and malnutrition, and yet they have this unshakable faith that they just keep producing their shoes, that Starlink's going to return and everything will go back to being glorious. Well, it doesn't work out that way. So in the modern era of the 3025, the Marin hegemony's taken over the planet, and lo and behold, the planet's got thousands and thousands of warehouses that the citizens have been building and building over the 20-odd years during the Amorous Crisis and the years slightly after that before the Marians step in. And they've got untold millions of pairs of shoes of all styles, types, and makes. And they're still exporting them and shipping them and selling them in the periphery and in the nearby intersphere houses as of 3025 because of the Marin hegemony. Just as an example, right? So as these automated factories require some highly skilled technicians and engineers and designers and stuff to operate and to function, and if you decide to eliminate the Archer factory for your rival by nuking the planet, nuking the city that it's sitting in or sitting adjacent to, in the process of destroying the planet and denying that factory to your rival, you've also obliterated its support services and all the small secondary factories that were nearby that supported it, and part manufacturers and so on and so forth, and distributors, warehouses, and things like this. And more importantly, all the skilled and educated people needed to run and keep this thing functioning well. So over the decades, after three succession wars, we get into the era of 3025, and we find a lot of machinery that was being produced years ago, and the factories are no longer around, but we're still managing to keep those machines up and running, those mechs functionable. Some places there are warehouses full of parts, so we still can get some parts for them. This is why some of these earlier mech designs that were, by modern standards, are total crap, are still around in significant numbers, is because A, they were produced in massive amounts of numbers to begin with, and that just allowed them to survive in numbers. B, they were crappy mechs even then, and they didn't see a whole lot of use, as much use as what other mech designs did, and so they were regulated to storage and or training facilities and or the frontier and or third line defense units that tend to run away at mainline units when they attack. This means their equipment stuck around, and then or the fact that there's just lots and lots of parts laying around that keeps these things functioning. So if you can't get the other part of that is there's a lot of factory lines, a lot of mech lines that are sidelined during the succession wars because the factory doesn't run anymore. The factory's got some missing component or some aspect that the current technical staff simply can't fix anymore, because they learned to fix it. The doohickey breaks. This is what we do to fix the doohickey, and this is what my granddad did, and great granddad did, and Uncle Joe did, and Fred over there's dad did, and that's how they showed us how to do it. But why? Why do we fix it that way? We haven't a clue. Why do we use this thing, this diode, or this computer board, or this thingamajig? We don't know. Where do we get the thingamajig? Well, there's a box of them in the warehouse out back. Well, we're almost down to what happens when the box runs out. Nobody knows. Then the factory gets shut down and shut off. That's just the way it is. So when you obliterate not only the physical assets of the manufacturing lines, but you take out the people who know how to operate them and maintain them, and to revitalize them and potentially rebuild them, that causes problems too. And we didn't think about it till after the fact. So this same loss of knowledge and skill means non-automatic factories are much more difficult to build, requiring more hands-on assembly lines to be created. So let's take that into account. A lot of I'll get those, well, why don't they just build other factories? They just need more people to, we can still manufacture this, we can hand tool this. Okay, sure. And they do that on a very small scale. If you look at the periphery nations, for example, some of those periphery nations are doing just that. They're able to produce limited amounts of battle mechs and tanks and armored personnel carriers and so on and so forth, in part because they had a John Deere factory out there producing combine mechs or cherry pickers, literal fruit picking mechs, and because the machinery is not too awful indifferent from making a war machine, the same principle that comes up through the Dark Ages kind of era of Battletech starts to emerge, where we're going to Frankenstein some mechs together so we have something that functions like a mech. Let's slap that AC2 on that agri-mech over there, and now we have a piss poor arm, piss poor engine, piss poor heat, whatever thing with a weapon on it. It's a piss poor weapon, but it's still something, which makes it something, and we will do that. So if we're going to make lower tech factories, no matter how sophisticated we try to be, no matter how much we try to mimic and copy the high-tech Starlink era stuff, there's elements there we're just not going to be able to understand or replicate, or we don't have the materials or resources to replicate the vital components. So the after products are not going to be as good as the stuff that could have been produced if it was a frontline, mainline Starlink era factory producing it. The other side of that coin would be, of course, is that the materials themselves. One of the reasons why so many of the 3025 mechs are using, when the clans remerge after the Hell Memory Core starts to see an uptick and a number of other things come out, and then the clans arrive, we start seeing a reintroduction. What we all think is, oh, these are fantastic weapons, and the clans come in with all this new and unheard of stuff. Well, the truth is, it turns out later that they're not unheard of. They're just improved upon stuff that existed before the first succession war took its toll, and the second succession war took its toll. From a player perspective, the game companies introduced a whole nother layer of goodies, and then in the backstory, this is how they justified it. So take that into mind. Until more recent eras, there's not a whole lot of real true innovation. A lot of it's just rediscovering old innovation or expanding on the old innovation. Got some chuckle news for you young folks today. That fancy little thing you call a cell phone that you just married to and absolutely cannot live without. My generation came up with that thing in the 80s. Yeah, it was ugly, it was massive, it was heavy. It surely didn't have 100 of the options and things that you can do with your phone now. But guess what? The cell phone is no different. Today's cell phone is still fundamentally the exact same thing as that big, huge, heavy brick that everybody was chucking around in the late 80s or early 90s. What we've done is improved upon the existing technology. The existing technology, we did not reinvent the wheel. The wheel just has pneumatic rubber tires surrounding it and has sensors to help monitor and make sure that it's aired up and it's done this and it's done that. So we haven't re-engineered something, we've improved vastly on it. So it's quite plausible if our technology base today was to take a hit and we lose a lot of the micro technology, microcell abilities that we have today to create these tiny little machines that we take for granted, that 50 years ago or 20 years ago, we could still manufacture something that was bigger, not as functionable, but still would do what we needed to do. And that's what these guys are forced to do. And this causes us to create and or adopt machinery that's less than favorable for a number of reasons. So, moving on, a number of Starlink era and 3050 era mech components require ever more sophisticated production. Indosteel, for example, is made in 0G, or at least that's what it's implied. Indosteel has to be used in 0G factories, which are highly tech facilities that they're obliterated during the start of the various secession wars, and it wasn't until recent times that the technology on the grand scale has allowed for the skill and technical expertise to be relearned to produce these things and put them back into orbit to produce these very endoskeletons that we wish. Now, unless somebody's changed the lore, the game companies have changed how endo steel was manufactured. Originally, when it came out, it was said that they had to be done in zero-G conditions. Diverse needs and wants of the houses so we're on our next point. The other major source of mech production is variety, i.e., many designs are either copies of earlier versions of variants of the originals, or in rare cases as of 3025, actual attempts at building something new, typically grounded in 3025 era tech levels. So, just like the automobile industry, if you've owned a car in your lifetime, and you've owned several, and I've owned probably 7 or 8 of them by this time, you might probably have developed a preference for a particular brand. So would you prefer an American-made car? Would you prefer a Japanese-made car? Would you prefer a British-made car or a French-made car? Or would you prefer a Russian-made car? You don't see very many Russian-made cars in America. There's a lot of Chinese-made cars, because what are they? They're Chinese-made cars are basically Japanese-designed cars, or copies of American designed cars being produced in Chinese factories for sell in the Western market. That in reverse, the Eastern European countries that manufacture cars, especially the former Soviet Union and the current Russia and things like this, manufacture cars, but they don't come over here very rarely do you see them. You don't see any dealerships selling them, at least not in the Midwest or where I'm at, and you don't see them on the roads. And from everything I've heard, they still function, but they're shit. They have a lot of problems. They're not nearly as well built as Western cars, and the Asian market cars are far better built than the American built cars today. And that's just the hard facts of the realities of things. So when the various houses are attempting to keep up with the Joneses, or more importantly, just be able to keep up by producing whatever the hell they can get their hands on, they're going to produce some very crazy stuff and go and stick whatever it is they can in the field. And often situations that we should never put them in. Here's the beloved urban mech, a slow, heavy into the light class, slow machine, poorly, it's actually fairly armed. It's not so well armored. Its biggest problem is it doesn't have much ammo to stick around very long. Its ammo is subpar for its weight class, but its speed is crippling. But more importantly, let's look. I just saw it in this environment, and I immediately thought this is the wrong environment for an urban mech. You do not want it out in an open area, because it's just going to be a sitting target. It's going to be a very slow moving target. It might jump away if it's lucky, but it's going to get run over. And pretty much every mech out there is going to be able to do that. This thing is meant to be in close quarters combat, in close confined areas, and preferably with lots and lots of cover, because it's a pure ambush mech, and that's all it's good for, or it's good for non-war conditions. If you're using this thing to, I don't know, patrol an airfield just to keep the local riffraff, awed by something that big, or you're out there hunting womp rants in the swamp, this thing might be to your advantage. But obviously, you know all the memes if you've been around long enough. So, and we're back to this argument on my next major point. There's never enough mechs, ever. By 3025 and over 200 years near constant conflict, mech production simply cannot keep up with combat losses. It is this level of loss in material that creates the slowdowns and or temporary peace in the inner sphere far more than actual peace talks and negotiations. The various factions need the time to pause, to rebuild and reinforce their forces, and to stockpile for the next push. Raids become the commonplace engagements during these, quote, laws. So once again, you go into full bore and you have some major confrontations. Right now, in the current age of Battletech, we see an almost steady level of conflict. There's been a bit of a bit of a slowdown recently, but it's not very significant. So the Draconis Combine has taken a major bite out of the Federated Suns. it's doing so in part because it doesn't have any significant threat coming at it from another angle. It's not being attacked by any of the clans, and it's not being, and the House Steiner is not in a position to go after it either. So it has the luxury to focus on that one foe, the Federated Suns. But it is, in my opinion, it's exceeding it's pushed its boundaries a little bit too far. Once again, this is not the first time. This is the first time they may have captured New Avalon. It is not the first time that the Draconis Combine has come that close to severing the Federated Suns and taking a big, huge chunk out of it, and almost taking its capital, because it's done that before. And historically speaking, it did that in the First Succession War. Problem is, it's overextending itself. It's overextending itself, and more importantly, it's expending its resources faster than it can replace them. At some point, this is going to cause a problem. They're either going to have to rally, buy time to restock their material, and or withdraw and consolidate and narrow down their logistics chain. I suspect when you look at the Empire Alone scenario that's currently in play, the Ill Clan is sitting on Terra. Othar has not heard, Colonel Othar has not heard one lick out of his Ilkhan or out of his leadership or their Toman that's sitting on Earth. All the wolves went to Earth, and since then, we haven't heard jack. We know, those of us who read the book and the novel and the Ilkhan stuff. Now, I would, one of these days, I'm hoping to get the Ilkhan source book if I can still get it. But I've read the novel for the invasion of Terra, so I got a really good idea what went down there. The Wolf Tomlin took an ass whooping. Yeah, they won. Don't be wrong. They won. They beat the Jade Falcons. They beat the Republic of the Sphere. You know, they pulled in every card they could. They manipulated every avenue of support they could get. And at the end of the day, though, they still took an ass whooping, and their military unit is very bad shape. It's going. They need the time to regroup and reinforce and to get ready for the next big thing, and to determine exactly what that next big thing is. We don't know what's going on there. We don't know what is going on in Alec Ward's mind, so I'm on purely speculation. But I think a big part of this is the Tolman hasn't returned to the Wolf Empire because A, it doesn't want or doesn't need the majority of the Wolf Empire, like some people like to think it ought to, not with its control of Terra and probably the immediate region around it, or it's attempting to reestablish the Star League hegemony kind of concept. The other part is it simply doesn't have the numbers, and they need to lick their wounds, reinforce everything, take advantage of the stockpiles of stuff that they've acquired while sitting on Terra in this conclusion of winning Terra, and going from there. They are regrouping right now, and when they get their shit together and they come out of Terra, they're going to come out swinging like a banshee. Or maybe they won't. Maybe I'm completely off base with my suppositions. All right. So the Mech specialist, next thing, why there's so many dodgy, questionable designs. Mech speciality. During the height of the Star League era, many designs were created to fill a specific niche or role, from dedicated recon to brawlers and long-range missile support mechs. This means that many 3025 era mechs were not intended for the use that they are often pressed into. Simply put, when you devastate each other's ability to mass produce something, something else has to fill its place. So missile boats become ambushers and skirmishers. Sniper and strikers become recon mechs. Striker and brawlers are pressed into the juggernaut roles. It is in this lack of numbers that saw even great houses resorting to using non-mech units even more. Tanks, VTOLs, etc. Normally, units regulated to support or home defense roles are thrust into frontline units. Meanwhile, we see things like this. We see like this visual we're looking at right now, an urban mech, which is a quietly questionable design and not very popular by most people who ever use them, being pushed and pressed into a situation and an environment that it absolutely has no business being in. This thing is just a target waiting to get snapped up. The only thing that's probably keeping this Irby alive right now is the fact that there's a bigger, more threatening machine in the background supporting it, and its opponents are going to go after that thing before they're going to go after that Atlas before they go after the Irby, because it's the bigger threat to them at the moment. So when you look at that from that perspective, excuse me a second, you look at that perspective, the house is, you know, in our modern era, if we had to start pulling things, we got so bad, we had to start pulling World War II and Korea era tanks and APCs out of museums and pressing them into combat. We're in a bad situation. But when you do that on a regular basis all the time, it becomes commonplace, and you kind of shrug it off as being what it is. It's also one of those things where we look at a lot of mech designs that were specifically intended to do something. So if I look at the Rifleman, for example, Rifleman's primary reason is a long-range sniper mech, but more important probably is an anti-aircraft platform. It excels in that role. It itself is grossly under-armored for what frontline combat and close combat, which it often sees itself thrust into. In many of the lore and stories of storied mech warriors who piloted riflemen, they move these things into combat scenarios that they really have no business being in the first place. And so when you do that, you can't be surprised that the mech's going to be terribly underweight and undergunned. It's one of those things that people that love and hate the Shadowhawk, for example. Most people love the appearance of the Shadowhawk. It looks great. It looks slick. It looks like something that ought to be badass, but in reality is kind of undergunned, under-armored, doesn't have enough heat sinks to really do what any of its one roles well. So it's kind of a jack of all trades that's not well suited to any of them, which has its downfall too, because now you're trying to cover too many bases, or you're forced to cover so many bases that you're basically not going to do well on any of them. So aside from its aesthetics perspective, it's still a very popular mech, because a lot of players that over the years take one look at it and they fall in love with it, and then they put it in the field and then they struggle with it. And or it just becomes one of those. If you can work it together in a group of others and work off each other's weaknesses and strengths, then you have chances with it. If you field this thing by itself or in a lance of Shadowhawks, unless it's going after some stuff grossly undergunned or underweight from its own capacity, it really isn't a liability and not a asset to you. And this is from a person who played many Shadowhawks for many decades and still have quite a few in my box over here. Well, I think I got one or two survived, but I had probably 8 of these things in my miniature collection at one point, because I always found them as kind of being an integral link with a couple other mech designs, in my opinion. And sometimes my tactics and use of the machine worked, and sometimes they didn't. But if you look at the overall thought process, most of the professional, hardcore enthusiasts who spend a lot of time crunching the numbers and doing the math on what's the best machine, the min-maxers in the game, will tell you that this is one of the lesser of the good ones. You know, it's just, you know, the Charger, and I had an image for Charger, and it turns to be really blurry, but the Charger, the original Charger, yeah, the CGR-1A1 is a total shitstorm. I mean, it's a heavy, it's an assault mech. It's got reasonable armor, but it's slow, like an assault mech, but it's so woefully undergunned that it's pitiful. And the fact that what did it sacrifice all them weapons for? You know, if it's not carrying enough weapon load to be a threat to anything other than a light mech, but the light mechs, you can't chase them down, well, so it's not getting any extra speed. It's not an energy platform with a buttload of heat sinks because they didn't put that many in it. It's not a juggernaut so heavily armored that you could beat on it for a week and still not take it down. So what did they exchange for? You know, it's not until later generations and later variances and so heavy modifications does the Charger start to carve out a niche for itself. It's more modern. As of 3070, 3060, the modern variants of that age made it a much more viable mech and machine. But in reality, it's almost no longer a Charger. You know, you've modified it to the point where it ceased to be what it originally was. Now it's a completely different machine. Because at the end of the day, too, a bicycle is a bicycle is a bicycle. It's what they do with that bicycle. It's the little peripheral stuff that they stick on it, the better tires, the better great, the better, the lighter materials that go into it, perhaps the gear ratios, et cetera, that make it stand out more than this design or that design. So it's possible to take the same frame from pretty much every mech design ever built and build yet another variant of something that looks new, but in reality is just a differently put together Valkyrie or Irby, right? You know, hate it or love it, that's just the way it is. Then it would come down to the regular, straight up bad designs. And you're always going to have some that should never have made it past the R&D or the test phase. And of course, there are the mechs whose designs are frankly subpar from concept to combat. These designs somehow manage to be put into production, rather through greed, bribery, or pure desperation. They continue to roll off production lines and or were produced in such numbers that they still survive. They're dropped into formations desperate for any machine, any mech. Some might even argue a crappy mech is still better than no mech at all. And if you're in a situation where you don't get to pick and choose, once again, and I go on about this sometimes in length when I get into a rambling diatribe on a sidebar on some other video. Look, no offense, some of the greatest players out here today and avid enthusiasts seem to forget the initial concept of Battletech was not this pick and push. You didn't get to sit down and cherry pick the mechs you wanted to have with the exact weapon systems, the exact configurations. This isn't Magic the Gathering. You don't get to put together the perfect deck prior to sitting down on the damn battlefield field. You're supposed to have had a unit created. You're using a lance, a company, a battalion, or a regiment, and that has a TOA, a table of organization, a table of organization equipment. The TOE, excuse me, the TOE, and within that TOE is what you have. So if your second battalion's alpha company is made up of 3 lances of this, that, and the other thing, that's what they have. So if that's the unit that gets put into a scenario to go up against another foe, or whether it's an opposing force, an op for another player's whatever, they don't get to go in there and look at their entire TOE and say, I want this unit, or I want this mech, and this mech to make up my lance. Because I know that's what I'm facing over there, because I can see what you're facing. That's not how that's supposed to work. Even if you have great intelligence on your foe, on your on your opponents, you should not. The spirit of the game is not how that's set up. Sometimes your units get put into scenarios that they are grossly outgunned by, or not suited for. And now the scenario is, can you survive that encounter? Can you actually win the encounter? Or is perhaps winning the encounter for you surviving and getting the hell out of it with as much of your equipment attacked as possible, and then about allowing yourself to maneuver one of your other units that are better suited for that scenario up against that unit while you can. See what I mean? But that's just my personal opinion on it, all right? Just my opinion. So we're often dropping machines into formations and filling glaring holes. So if you're in a conflict, ask yourself, okay, the Draconis Combine and the Federated Sons have been at each other's throat for the past 2 years in-game, in the current rendition. The Draconis Combine has hammered the hell out of the Federated Sons. Yet the Federated Sons has not collapsed yet. It has not surrendered. Because that's not how they do things in Battletech. They're going to rally and either pull a rabbit out of their hat or a dagger out of their ass and take it to the Koreans. And they're going to put the Koreans back on their heels. They're going to shove them back. They're going to beat on them. They're going to survive. They're going to recover, because that's how things do. And in the inevitable possibility that they up and croak, okay, because that happens too. Sometimes factions die. And there will be a whole lot of people hating on Catalyst if the House Davion takes a dump. If the Federated Sons ceases to exist as an entity, there are going to be a lot of people unhappy with that. But you know what? Potentially, that's just the way things go. You know, it's the same reason why things drop off for a reason. There's no reason. I love playing Wolverine, for the love of God, I do, but I really don't think that in any current rendition of the game do we really need to see them come back. There's just enough. There's too many factions to deal with now to throw yet another one in. you know, I don't know. That just starts reeking of greed and questionable design concepts behind the scenes. But since I'm not in Catalyst and I'm not privy to that stuff, you know, it's none of my business. It is what it is. So the same scenario. The Draconis Combine has pressed well into the Federated Sun space. Did you think they just suddenly whipped up 30 regiments of mechs and 40 regiments of support units and a half dozen warships and 100 jump ships from nowhere? No, they had to strip those things away from a lot of other places, a lot of other fronts, a lot of other security systems, a lot of other defense positions to reinforce that and to conquer and to hold that vast amount of territory. They didn't just instantly create themselves an entire different set of armies out of nothing. They don't have the Comstar to pull on for this battle. It's not 3039, I can tell you that right now. So they had to plug and play whatever they got. And they take battle losses and damage, and they've been using up their consumables at a prodigious rate. So you can only retool the factories. You capture your opponent's worlds, and you try not to damage those factories now, because we learned some harsh, valuable lessons over the last couple hundred years. These things are very strategically desirable. You want those munition factories intact. More importantly, you want the people that work in them intact too. And so you can keep them working and keep cranking out them autocannon shells and those missiles and stuff that keep your military, supplied. Meanwhile, if you can acquire a couple of the enemy's Battletech factories, and you can keep producing their machines, you do it. So you don't spend 3 years retooling those factories to produce your design and your house eccentric machinery. No, you produce whatever the hell. If that's a blackjack factory, you're going to keep cranking blackjacks out and throw them into your military. And this is one of the reasons why over the centuries, all the factions field machinery from all other factions at some point. And this is one of the many avenues that happens. So anyway, at this point, the Draconis Combine is finding itself probably in a pickle. There was another reason why when I did my little video on the Draconis Rift book, more importantly, behind the scenes of the big story, in the background of the bigger picture, the Cretan's leadership has realized if they're going to really quick a push into Davion, especially after they realize they got the position and they take advantage of it, being able to hire a lot more mercenaries is crucial. So patching that relationship with the Wolfstrike Goons is genius. And to actively support the Ryukin's rescue efforts to save what's left of their Dragoon Striker units that get cut off is also genius, because this stuff gets out. And other Merc units start going, okay, so maybe the current version or the current generation of the Krita, House Krita has got their act together and see our value again, at least for the moment. So it's going to open the doors for more Merc units to go, will be more willing to take contracts working for the Draconis Combine. Because as we know, the house militaries rarely are the end-all to beat-all. Every house, even the most powerful at the time, in the Federated Commonwealth, at its height of its power, still employed numerous Merc units for twofold reasons. One is to bolster your own forces at a relative reasonable cost. Two is to deny those forces to your opponents. If you don't want your opponents to belly up with a bunch of mercs, you better keep those mercs on the payroll. Just reduce the playing field a bit, in my opinion, right? Just some thought. So, marginally bad designs used improperly. This goes with the "we ain't got nothing else, boss. It's the Charger or it's an Agrimech." There are some designs that are now infamous as being too slow, too weak, too undergunned, and yet for what purpose were they originally intended for? Look at the Urban Mech. We debate and lambast and meme the Irby to death, and for the most part, this machine is, once again, it's too slow for its weight class. It's too undergunned for what they want it to do, and you marry it up with that crappy speed, even with jump jets, it's very limited in the environment that it's going to have any good success at. And yet, it was produced in huge amounts of numbers. Even after the last factory, they didn't reopen the Irby factory until the Jihad era, by my understanding. So a good 70, 80 years goes by, but there's still such a huge number of these things that have been produced, in part because A, they were cheap, B, nobody wanted them except everybody needed to have them, so they end up in a lot of third line places and out of the way places where they don't see a lot of combat, and they're easy to maintain. Or so they become parts. They can become part wells for other machinery, or they become the we ain't got nothing left in the warehouse but the Irby's boss. Put them in the field, and they do what they got to do. So, by most conventions, this Mediocre mech is a disaster. Once again, too slow, too undergunned, too lambasted to ever be given a fair shake. Its design all or most others are compared to. Well, Lieutenant, at least it's not an Irby. Okay, Urban mechs are slow. It's got 32 kph. It's undergunned. It's only packing an AC-10 and a small laser. Light on the ammo. Only carries 1 ton of ammo for the AC-10, so it's got 10 shots. 6 tons of armor. It's enough to match some mechs at twice its size, to be truthful. So it's actually fairly well armored, and it has jump jets. Those jump jets often get overlooked in its flexibility for maneuverability. So yes, it's slow. It's not going to outrun anything. It's not going to run away from things. It's not going to chase something down. But it can maneuver around them fairly easily with that jump jet. And if they have plenty of cover to work with, then it has a viable option for survivability. So perhaps one of the most, if not most, maligned urban mechs in history. The urban mech is too slow to chase its foes, too slow to evade its foes. Hey, I just said all that. Lacks enough ammo for a prolonged engagement, only packs 2 weapons, and looks like 100 memes. So if it's so bad, why does any faction bother to field them? All right, just so we're on the same page. I take notes. Just saying. Sometimes I ramble stuff off, and I do, but sometimes I spend a couple weeks gathering these things just so we know. I make an effort. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying, Okay, number 1, compared to most mechs, Irbies are cheap. It's just the truth. They're cheap. Number 2, they are abundant. While we have had no hard numbers to how many of these each mech variants exist, lore repeats numerous times that there are a lot of Irbies in existence, even that the Blakist reopened a factory to produce them there in the Jihad. We also know that the houses, the clans, the mercs, and the periphery use them to some extent. Even the clans have a clan variant of the urban mech. Why? Because it's a mech. Because it has weapons, it's a platform. It has a role, a purpose. If nothing else, it has something to put that idiot person you don't like in your lance into, just so you got somebody to say, "I've got 4 machines in my lance." Number 3, considering that the many limitations, they're easy to repair and maintain. That's another thing. Look at this thing. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty accessible. It's not overly complicated. I'm going to guess it's not that hard to fix and work on. This means it is a mech. This meme of a mech is an ambusher in the strictest sense of the word. It's best used in tight confines of urban contents and or rugged terrain such as canyons and forests, mostly cities and industrial parks, where their limitations can be offset. Close to resupply and repair, used in teams, alliances, and or supported by tanks, etc. Preferably hidden before an enemy enters the preferred environment. The thick urban and industrial settings reduce the speed and hinder the movability of pretty much every mech that enters it. It also presents plenty of obstacles that the plain, stubby, barrel-like urban mech can mimic and be mistaken for. Think about that. Look at this thing and then put it inside of an industrial park or a refinery. If you're not paying attention to what you're looking at, this thing potentially could be overlooked until you stumbled across it or it shot you in the back. There's that possibility. And when we talk an urban environment, stop thinking in terms of the Los Angeles urban sprawl with its frickin' massive highway system with lots of open stretches of space. More think of something like the inner cities of Chicago and Detroit and New York City, and the quite confined man-made canyons of towering buildings and narrow alleyways, and there's the environment this little bad boy really is meant to be in. Just saying. So, I cannot say how often I hear others lambast this mech or that mech for it being not worth its battle value. I get it. I do, and yet. The setting that is Battletech is not perfect, not by a jump. To pretend so is being disingenuous at best and insulting at worst. If anything, Battletech is an exercise in making do. We've come a long way from the battle droids concept. This I know, but we don't do ourselves or our fellow players or Battletech itself any justice if we forget that not every battle is perfect. Not every engagement is measured or fair. Just as a lone urban mech on an open plain is hosed, a warhammer alone in the tight confines of an urban blight, ambushed by a lance of concealed urbies, is just likely as hosed. Just saying, right? Personally, I find a bit of the designs questionable at best. Actually, I find a lot of the designs questionable at best. Too easy to overheat, too under-armored for their roles, too expensive to repair. More so, I find it a bit sad that so many players are focused on the min-max or perfect balance of points for an encounter and less open to the idea that my company at Compelling Hussars has. Blank. But then I'm getting old and the games change. Finally, and I bring this to this conclusion, as I said, Battletech is a game of make do. The ideal battle is a clan thing, and that thinking has screwed the clans over more than anything else. Part of the fun of finding yourself using a bad mech is using it brilliantly. Not only making do, but making it work when everything else thinks it's stupid. That's the pure genius of Battletech. Tell my friends this is Rick, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.